Hello, and welcome to Let's Talk Transformation Podcasts. So, if you've ever felt like the rules weren't built for you, and if you're ready to lead with courage and purpose and not just climb the corporate ladder, this episode is for you. I'm delighted to welcome today's guest, Jodi Vandenberg-Daves, historian, coach, and author of Leading with Courage. Jodi, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
It's really nice to have you on the show, Jodi. Um, your most recent book, Leading with Courage, is rewriting for me what leadership stands for. And I know that that's a subject close to your heart, helping leaders to work collaboratively to create better workplaces and community environments where people of all backgrounds and identities can essentially thrive. So let's start there. We're going to dive into how leadership, courage, and values converge, and how also caregiving, generational wisdom, and a career long view of impact can transform how we lead in today's world. So, Jodi, can we start with a time or a moment in your story, in your career journey, when you sensed that you could lead with courage without necessarily having a formal title?
Yeah, that's a good question. I kind of think back to a moment when I was a junior faculty member and I just found myself standing up. There was an effort to change the rules about who could vote on
Mm.
department decisions based on their rank.
Ah.
I would have been included in the voting, but someone else would not have been based on her
Mm.
rank, and it felt like it might have been a little personal, and more than that, it felt like why would we have a person sitting around the meeting table who participates and teaches and
Yeah.
doesn't get a voice in things? And
Mm.
I stood up to senior faculty, and it just felt good and it felt right, and I made a lifelong friend in that person. As well. And went on to collaborate together in many ways.
Mm.
And it just, yeah, that was a moment. It had nothing to do with title. It was kind of challenging hierarchy. And um, then went on to try to create environments where people were included and everybody had a voice, regardless of rank and status and position in a department or a
Mm.
unit or a
Mm.
organization.
And I think that's so important, isn't it? And particularly for women, because today we are still working in male-dominated industries,
Mhm.
organizations, institutes. But I think having the courage to call it out and to
Mhm.
stand up and speak anyway is really important, which brings me to, leadership not being about a position or a
Mhm.
title or, what's written in a box on an organizational chart, but more of it being a lifelong practice. And, for me, that story of you leading with courage, which is essentially what you did, you stepped over it and said what you had to say anyway.
Mhm.
What's the first fear that you had to overcome there, Jodi? And, can we formalize it? Because
Mhm.
I work a lot with leaders on this, and often they don't dare. But the first step for me is to formalize what the fear is behind not daring.
I mean, the fear is retribution. The fear
Mm.
is that, and in academia, people have sophisticated ways of doing retribution, but they still do it.
Yeah.
And so, but I think that it didn't matter to me in that moment. In that moment, it was just like it was clarity, and I think one of the things that I found in my research for this book
Mm.
and is a key argument in the book is that finding those moments of clarity is empowering for us,
Mm.
actually. When we're aligned with our values, we can take the heat, not
Mm.
always. I mean, not always. Let's just be clear.
Yeah,
Like
yeah, yeah.
forces can be overwhelming. Women can be and are driven out of environments sometimes, for speaking
Mm.
up too much.
Mm.
But there are those moments when it's like I may not be, punching at the system all the time, but there are moments when I have to find my clarity, and I didn't even really think that much about it.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, not that I've done that all the time, not that I haven't let fear, get to me. We all have,
Mm.
but there are
Mm.
those moments when I think the fact that I was able to think of that decades later says
Mm.
something about what it meant to me, to speak
Mm.
with integrity.
Yeah, totally. And I think clarity is one of those things that also brings with it courage and confidence. When you're
Mhm.
clear about what you want
Mhm.
to say, why you want to say it from a place of values. I think it brings me to this discussion that I have a lot with people and also with myself around the fact that we all have personal agency in systems.
Yes.
However
Hmm.
small it may seem, however big the system may seem, I'm a big believer in everybody having agency. And I think women also have agency in their systems, although it doesn't often feel like that, because they have multiple identities in the systems they live and work in. So, mother, wife, head of, etc., etc. How, and when I hear you speaking, I'm thinking sometimes that identity can actually become leadership capital.
It
How do you see
it
women using that, Jodie?
Yeah, it absolutely is. And I want to just circle back a little bit to agency. I mean, I believe that sometimes our we don't see our agency. We might
Mm,
even leave an organization. And I've seen this happen a few times in my
mm,
consulting work where people will raise those disruptive questions and make a difference, but the
mm.
difference often won't come until later, or they're too fed up by the time they get to that point,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
maybe they're on their way
exhausted.
out, but
Mm,
their difference lives on in, the employee handbook and in
mm,
the people they
mm,
influence to lead a little bit
mm,
differently. Our agency, we can't always measure it, but I do encourage people to be looking for it, to be looking for ways in which their ideas are amplified, because especially if we're feeling strain, we might be focusing more on the things that aren't working.
mm,
But notice when people amplify your ideas, circle back to people who still work there and say, has anything changed? And maybe the answer will be no, but sometimes I really have found that it's yes, yes, some things have changed. Um, so your question was also about sort of leading from women's strengths. Was that generally
Yeah,
what
and
you're asking?
how can our identity as women, and it's often multiple, how
Right,
can it
multiple
become
identities. Yeah.
leadership capital? Because I think the system is always playing a song back to us that we're not
Mhm.
in the right place.
Yeah, I mean, to me, all you have to do is Google the top leadership skills, and you will see that most of those skills are skills that women and other people who've been marginalized
Mm,
can often have lots of, because we have had to learn how to navigate systems. We've had to develop context awareness, which is itself a leadership skill.
mm,
But flexible thinking, emotional agility, strategic disruption, including asking challenging questions, those
mm,
are things that leaders need. Team building, humility. And research shows that women are more likely to help as managers, they're more likely to help manage other people's workloads. They're
mm,
more likely to champion and move the needle on diversity, equity, and inclusion. They're more likely to champion policies around sexual harassment,
mm,
childcare, other issues. They're rated as better listeners and team builders by people who report to them on
mm,
average. So, and people of color often have a lot of these similar skills, of having to like code switch in different
yes.
environments, which creates that communication agility as well.
Mm,
And being able to hold space for complexity. Because
mm.
when we move through systems smoothly, as if because they're just made for us, we don't, there's a lot of like sort of toughening and
Mm,
um, complexity building that we don't necessarily have to do. But when we have to navigate those systems,
mm,
we develop a lot of emotional intelligence and a lot of context intelligence that
mm.
is really critical to leadership.
Yeah, and we're essentially developing the muscles, aren't we, for
Hmm.
navigating complexity, which is getting more and more present for all leaders. It's right there in front of our faces now. So having
Yeah.
that agility, both mental and emotional, I think is a big plus in the workplace. But how can we use it as the minority in systems in the system? How can we use it to disrupt the system? Because I'm a huge believer in, I
Hmm.
hate this discussion of fix the women. It's about
Right.
fixing the system.
Right.
And you've just listed a whole list of behaviors and reasons why women bring something different to the table, and not just women, but there are other diverse leadership skills.
Yeah.
So how
Yeah.
can we use those to actually disrupt the system and the systemic bias that exists?
Well, yes, I know. It's such a really difficult needle to thread, right? Of like
Yeah.
fix the women, fix
Yeah.
the systems. They definitely women's confidence can help them fix those systems,
Mm,
right? So that's why it's tricky. But I think one piece of that comes with naming and claiming what those skills are. Um,
mm,
because women, there's still a lot of research suggesting that people think of white men as natural leaders, and women are
mm,
also like have a really hard time saying that word ambition and claiming
mm,
their ambitions.
mm,
And so claiming ambition, claiming those strengths, I mean, those are important pieces of our work that I wish we didn't have to do. And
mm,
I also wish there were more men who would step up and go and learn about, gender humility and like ways in which women's
mm.
leadership is stellar. And you do hear those male voices sometimes, of course. I
Yes,
hear
you
it more
do.
than when I was younger, which is wonderful.
Mm,
Um, but I think it's teaming up with other people, it's leveraging strategic thinking, it's leveraging relationships, and it's when women do move up into those higher platforms. I think of formal leadership as a platform
mm,
that is it's more expansive than leading from anywhere. Leading from anywhere is important, and I write
mm.
about it through the whole book.
Yeah.
But a platform, you have more players you can influence, you have more ways to move up and down a hierarchy or to disrupt a hierarchy. So
Mm,
one of the women I interviewed for the book is a nonprofit CEO, and she just flipped so much of the hierarchy. She will just say, if I go on vacation, nothing really matters because it's other people doing this work. They are the key. They are the face of the organization. She developed all these feedback loops and systems so that
mm,
people vote on things like, do we want a 4-day work week? And after much, many machinations, yes, we do.
mm,
What about, like how our leave policies and our benefits and just creating ways that doors are open, that anyone can attend a board meeting, that all these ways that you can shift the hierarchy around.
mm,
I think another way is, and again, you don't have to be a top leader to do this, but I mentioned like teaming up,
mm,
cultivating networks of champions around the cause of inclusive workplaces.
mm,
I think that I did that quite a bit in my university role. And a colleague and friend of mine I thought she was masterful at it at a particular moment when there was something at the faculty senate floor that was really important. And I said, wow, your colleague in your department who's on the faculty senate really stepped up for that. And she said, well, that's because I worked on him, and I told him, like, I think you need to leverage your white male privilege some more. And here's the way that you can be part of that and you can do this. And
mm,
instead of just silently agreeing with us on principle, you can
mm,
actually use your voice. So
mm.
it's helping bring out those allies and that network of champions, finding spaces or creating your own spaces.
Mm,
What I've seen
mm.
a lot is people create their own spaces. If a conversation isn't happening through normal channels, you create your own spaces. You do have to be effective. It's always an act of disruption and diplomacy, right? You have
Yeah.
to kind of
Mm,
position your goals in the context of the mission of the organization and who
mm.
it's supposed to serve. It doesn't work just to say this will make my life better. It has to be positioned that way.
Mm,
But you can also appeal to people's decency and the reality that retaining talented people and building cohesive teams is really, really critical.
mm. And I think, there's so much in what you've just said, but what I'm taking away, two things, is the informal nature of these power dynamics. So,
Yeah.
I believe that transformation doesn't happen in roadmaps sitting at the C-suite table. It happens in the informal connections that you're talking about. It happens in the opportunistic but yet strategic understanding of the context and
Hmm.
having these conversations. So sort of the informal part, but also the building of coalitions and allyship. And as ever, it starts with understanding who we are and what the water is that we're swimming in. Because privilege, for
Hmm.
example, once I've understood my privilege, then the work starts because I can use it to
Yes.
leverage other things, just like unconscious bias training. It's once the bias is conscious that we can do something with it, we can disrupt the system, we can actually leverage. And I think values-driven leadership is hard to maintain because not everyone shares the same values, of course.
Hmm.
Um, but what you're talking about for me is strategic use of people living through their values and getting things done through the
Hmm.
collective. So, how do you sustain your values, Jodi, when the career playing field is asking you to compromise? And I'm talking about women, but not only, because there are
Hmm.
lots of people living in organizations that have a clash of values, but yet they
Hmm.
still want to lead through their values.
Yeah, there's no easy answer to
No.
that. But I think it is partly seeing that long arc of your career journey that you will
Mm,
be more and less aligned with your values at different points. That we can't fight every battle and keep our jobs and keep
mm,
the value that we're adding through our jobs. So
mm.
we have to be strategic about the battles we fight. But when we do it together, I mean, courage happens together, like
Yeah.
very often. When you look as a historian, I
Mm,
know that. And so you have your people that are kind of fortifying you, and that's not always the people strategically placed in the meeting. Sometimes that's just your work
yeah.
friends, your
Yeah.
friends outside of work that help sustain you. But I think it's doing a lot of audits for yourself of like, how aligned am I and how much can I tolerate? How much is this, if I'm so out of alignment over a period of time,
Mm,
I'm maybe not a good fit with this role or with
mm,
this organization. But if there are spaces I can carve out, it also depends on the size of the organization. If there's spaces of effectiveness that you can carve out, that can help you with your values alignment. So, for example, as a department chair,
mm,
building a team that felt cohesive, a diverse team with people with opinions and value,
mm,
strong, really strong values-oriented people. This was the Department of Race, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, after all, that
mm,
um, I chaired towards the end. Um, to feel that my leadership was working in that space, even if I was not as effective getting things above my level,
mm,
it still gave me a sense of we're building something here that's valuable. And
mm,
the ways in which we interacted with one another and treated one another as leaders, that can have a ripple effect,
mm,
in lots of different ways. And so sometimes you have to let it be enough, I think, your sphere of influence for a
mm,
while, depending on whether you need that job. Um, those are some ideas I have, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts as well. And
mm.
um,
But I mean, I think just as you were speaking, I was thinking about, the very fact that you're collaborating all the time in these informal networks and also making
Mhm.
these strategic decisions,
Mhm.
either within your sphere of influence or within a
Mhm.
larger sphere of influence. I think the discernment of contextual awareness is very, very important. And
Yeah.
I think sometimes we have to tell ourselves small is beautiful. So if I can
Yeah.
have the influence that I can have here, I can have
Yeah.
more impact than if I try and affect, have influence over the three concentric circles of my ecosystem. And I
Mhm.
think we are formatted often to try and do as much as possible. And I think
Yeah.
sometimes doing smaller things in a big way is
Yeah.
is really impactful, particularly in the huge machines and systems that are institutions, organizations, and not so much teams, but departments within large organizations. Because I think collaboration also gives us a great opportunity to level this playing field.
Yes.
To come back to the informal discussions that you've described, and we can see and hear the influence that is happening there. And I think it allows us to speak to the courage that lies silent in a lot of organizations, because
Hmm.
people don't dare, or because they're not in the center of what's happening, because they are consciously staying on the edges of the system where they can have more leverage. Um,
Yeah.
how do you think we can go about enabling those voices, Jodi? Because, I think the silent or marginal voices often hold some of the most innovative, different ideas, which of course aren't heard in the center because that's not what they're asking for.
Right. Well, sometimes it's, I think of a couple of different things. I think of how meetings are run and
Mm,
how informal conversations happen before or after meetings. So During meetings, it can work to be making sure everyone has like, is there anything you want to add? Is there anything you want to add?
Mm,
But recognizing that there's some people that are still not going to be super comfortable speaking out in meetings. They may need a conversation after the meeting
mm,
to, feel things out. It's
mm,
making sure if you're leading a team that everybody is getting heard in their own way, and knowing that for some people they may feel really like they have to be the voice of
mm,
a group of people whenever they speak up, and maybe they don't want to be speaking in meetings as much, so there might be other ways. I think another thing is to go and listen to the people who are willing to speak up, like
mm,
um I have a lot higher ed. You're seeing a lot of examples there, right?
mm,
But there was a group of women of color on campus who, so sorry, um, who basically came together to talk about how they experienced the campus, and they made themselves vulnerable by sharing that
mm,
in a forum. As a campus leader, I felt it was important to go to that forum and to hear people who, instead of asking people to represent their group, listening to the people who were willing to
mm,
take that risk to come out and say difficult things, and then to circle back and follow up and say, how can I, as with the mid-management leadership role I have,
mm,
how can I support your work? And so we found ways to do that. I instituted some department training and invited some people and got some funds for them to come and do some training with us. Um, and then we, also worked with some other people to create like our own leadership training on
mm,
some of the threats that women of color were feeling on campus, from like actual threat feeling from disgruntled students,
mm,
that were something that, white men generally are, much less at risk to have that happen, but even white women are less at risk
mm,
to have that happen. So
mm,
it's that piece of, if people are willing to talk, being really willing to show up and listen with cultural humility and then partnership. Um, that's what I tried to do in that
mm.
case.
And it's so important, isn't it? It's also this empathy piece of
Hmm.
questioning your status quo and actually leaving enough time to try and understand somebody else's lived experience, which may be a million miles away from your own, and often it
Hmm.
is, but it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, and it doesn't mean it isn't real. So,
Right.
which brings me to the new generation, but you've sort of answered some of my question. Because I was going to say, throughout your research and your daily interactions, do you see the generations coming in with a different perspective on leadership and reacting or disrupting differently? But you're saying that some of the students are already feeling this. So I'm interested to know what the intergenerational, particularly the younger generation coming in, are bringing to this perspective.
Well, and I worked with a subset of them who are
Mm,
very values driven over
mm,
my career.
mm,
And so that's a little bit of I'm not seeing the whole picture, but we
mm,
we do know from research that these millennials and Gen Z, they're more diverse racially
mm,
than any other group, any other generation in the
mm,
United States history, and they are coming at things. This is changing rapidly in the US. I mean, there
yeah,
were a whole bunch of young men who voted for Trump in 2024, for example, and
yeah.
even on college campuses, it switched pretty dramatically. So things are very much evolving, but there has been quite a bit of research showing more interest in racial justice and standing up for racial justice, feminism,
Mm,
LGBTQ rights. There are a lot of young people will say they don't want to work for an employer who isn't like forward on those
mm,
issues, like isn't actively
mm,
supporting LGBTQ rights, for example, and they don't have, that includes a lot of straight people who don't want to
mm,
work for those organizations. So there's been a bunch of research showing that. And what I always talk to young people about, early career too, in my coaching is honor your questions. Because you're asking, and I would say that to my students in the classroom, even teaching history, I would say
mm.
you are asking the next generation worth of questions that needs to
Questions.
be asked. Your generational experience is different, so you're going to have different questions. And those questions create new thinking. And
Mm,
you need to team up with people who can help you create space for those questions when you go into the workplace. Because in the college classroom, there's usually space for those questions.
Mm.
But in the workplace, that becomes trickier, but don't lose that sense that your questions matter. Why is it done this way? Is a
Mm.
really important question. Could it be done a different way? I mean, that's a lifelong thing. And when you're young and new, you have an angle on that, that's
Totally.
different, right?
Mm.
So, does that sort of answer your question, or was there a
No,
little more?
it totally answers my question. I was thinking, they bring a different perspective, they bring different questions, but after 5 years, they'll have been swimming in the same water as everyone else. So I think it's interesting to think about what they can bring because when I look at like reverse mentoring, which
Yeah.
and there is a bias to that says, oh, yeah, reverse mentoring. Okay, he or she can come and teach me how to use social media and
Right.
what the young generation think, in inverted commas. Whereas I think it's a lot more complex than that. And I think that two-way learning stream is a lot more two-way than that perspective gives it credit for. So, for example, shadow boards, which we used to do quite a lot of. If you put the younger generation into a board meeting, there's no point if you're not going to listen to that voice.
Exactly. And then really it is the smart organizations are going to have a kind of mentoring and reverse
Mm.
mentoring curve that is about really capitalizing
Mm.
on what those young people know, putting them together with other young people to help empower them, but putting them together with the formal and informal leaders in the organization who can
Mm.
help amplify their ideas and questions or show them how to pull the levers they can pull at their level,
Mm.
to feel like they're making an impact with their ideas.
Mm.
They also, I've been talking more about age humility that we
Mm.
need to have on both ends of the spectrum,
Yep.
there's a lot of move over boomer kind of stuff going around.
Mm.
And there are still some boomers in the workplace. Actually quite a few.
Yeah.
And there's Gen X, I'm an elder Gen X and
Mm.
millennial and Gen Z, right? And we need to be able to know that everybody there has a story and
Mm.
everybody has a different generational experience. And
Mm.
you don't want older people saying, well, we've already tried that and it didn't work.
Yeah.
Um, but you also don't want young people saying, just ignoring the experiences of old
Mm.
people, older people,
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
and like, well, what do you know? So it's how do you create spaces for that as well?
Mm.
I think that's important. A lot of employers are paying attention to that. There's a lot more conversation about intergenerational experiences. But I think, it's kind of like you said, it can be like kind of oversimplified into
Mm.
what they have to teach us is social media. I mean, what they have to teach us is partly what it's been like to come of age in a
Yes.
pandemic and a like, worsening economic inequality, high visibility of racial violence and racial
Mm.
injustice, of, the high visibility of sexual abusers who are in high positions in government. What are their attitudes towards our institutions and what, that they also, a lot of them came of age watching The Office as like this kind of cynical view of what the
Yeah.
workplace is. So
Yeah.
they're going to be, I grew up watching Mary Tyler Moore reruns,
Mm.
but like, here she was going to make it after all, and these are her
Mm.
dreams. And
Mm.
so, these young people have a lot more economic insecurity, a lot of fears about AI, a lot of things that we just need to listen to and hold space for to really
Mm.
honor their experiences.
Mm. And I think, if I look at the pandemic of loneliness, that is
Hmm.
not necessarily going to be helped by AI and the fact that we have
Yeah.
AI robots and chatbots and things like that. And the fact that the generation coming in have no pre-AI experience, to come back to,
Hmm. Right.
learning humility and age humility. What do you think? I was asking myself the other day, what does courage look like, therefore, in this augmented world?
Mm.
What are the new elements of courage that we can collaborate on, Jodi, with these new generations coming in? Because I feel personally we're missing a trick if we don't.
Hmm.
I try and do it in my personal life, with my nieces, nephews, my child, etc. And I think it's an important thing to try and understand their lived experience, but also what it means for society. So what does that mean for you for courage in the workplace?
Are you talking a lot about AI in that? Is AI threaded into that question? Am I
Yes,
understanding
AI
that?
is also threaded into that question. In this augmented sort of hybrid world,
Yeah.
does courage look different in the workplace, or is it still speaking to your values, standing up for what you believe in, making sure that it is inclusive? But we will be doing that very differently, won't we?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is the same, it's the same values and it's the
Mm,
same practices in a lot
mm,
of ways, but I feel like a really important thing is to give people space to interact with other people as human beings, and we have to be much more mindful about that.
mm, mm,
Since we went to a lot of um, hybrid and remote work,
mm,
and and then there's companies that are like, there's one in our area that's like, now everyone's coming back to work. Like in 2026,
mm,
everyone's going physically back to the office. Like
mm,
we have to be a lot more thoughtful about that, I think. And I think it's creating spaces for listening. What does AI mean to this younger generation? What are their fears about their jobs? How are they using it? I went
mm,
to a presentation by someone who's very knowledgeable about this not too long ago, and she pointed out the use cases that the top use case for AI in 2025 has been therapy. Like that's
well,
wild.
yeah.
And that was very different in 2024. So it's a technology that's emerging and evolving very quickly. So I feel like we need to have honest conversations that help allay people's fears and concerns. But that goes back to the same thing. You're
Mm,
listening, you're creating feedback loops, you're being humble about what you're learning from people. Their fears may be different than your fears.
mm,
If you already have a secure job, it might look different or semi-secure, whatever that is today.
mm,
It may look different than if you're trying to enter the job market and convinced that robots are going to make it impossible for you to get into
mm,
an entry-level job, you
mm.
know?
I mean, it's always one of those questions that I ask myself and that I will put to you now, Jodie. If you were mentoring your future self 15 years ago, what's the one thing that you would insist on?
Hmm.
So, through all your research, your experience, your writing your books, because I know a lot of your impact comes through writing as well. You know,
Hmm.
what would be the one thing that you would insist to your future self 15 years ago?
I think it would be developing even deeper practices of self-connection and self-trust.
Mm.
I mean, even though I've been on this earth a while, we still, there's so many buffeting forces, right?
Mm.
And so many, and learning to tune into yourself and get clear with yourself. Um, that's even
Mm.
though I'm talking about clarity and I can find that in a lot of key moments, that doesn't mean I don't go home at night and obsess about it sometimes, you
Of
know?
course.
So
Yeah.
I guess that would be it.
Yeah, and I suppose the human operating system doesn't change that much. I mean, everything is changing around it, but the way we function as humans
Yeah.
changes a lot less quickly, doesn't it? But
Yeah, that's a good way to put
mm,
it. Yeah.
mm, but your question around, well, your comment around clarity and understanding strategically where you want to spend your time and leadership brings me to the idea of boundaries. And
Hmm.
I, for me, and I often have this conversation with myself, my peers, but also with the younger generation around setting boundaries
Yeah.
with with yourself, particularly regarding tech and the amount of time we spend on tech and the amount of time, what we what we let ourselves watch and listen to is just as
Hmm.
important as the food we eat and the exercise we do in terms of feeding the human mind, body, soul. So, what's one boundary that you've found really helpful? A boundary that you've set yourself, Jodin, that has sort of set you up for the career-long impact, if you like.
Um, my boundaries, I do have to kind of shift them with different time
Of
over
course.
time, but
Mm.
I really made it a practice not to work on the weekends, and a lot of my colleagues did not do that. I mean, I would just, I mean, that sounds simple, but for my
It's not simple.
career, I didn't work on the weekends. Very rarely, sometimes if I did, it would be like a deep thinking thing, some of
Mm,
my writing, journal articles or my book.
mm,
Um, so that's one that's been very important to me. My being trying to be present with my family.
mm,
I usually don't work at night either, like I will get up early in the morning. I will push really, really hard, but and through my career in higher ed, I didn't answer emails after 6 p.m. Because I was also trying to model that
mm,
I'm not available all the time.
mm,
And, that's something maybe other people could think about. I believe that we set our boundaries and then things expand and we have to, it's not a one and done. Those things sustained me for a long time, I will say. But there
mm,
were so many other hard things
mm.
that there's just work creep,
Yeah, totally.
relationship stress creep from work
Mm,
itself being,
mm,
the fact that some people, would look to me as a mediator or someone to show up in a difficult tenure hearing or things like that. There's just a lot of emotional labor that you have to manage when you are in the thick of work. And
mm,
I think about a concept I've learned more recently that I guess also if I were going to mentor myself, I wish I would have kind of known this sooner. I do find it helpful. It's internal boundaries. The
yeah,
idea that you're not just setting boundaries with your choices and what you're willing to do and what you're willing to say no to and how you're standing up for your values. It's that external relationships with people or relationship with external projects, but also internal boundaries is something a little more fuzzy, but I have found it
mm,
like the metaphor I like best is zipping up my core and holding my energy in. I
mm,
found it especially valuable in meetings, in running meetings when I am as a trained people-pleasing woman, I am very
yeah,
like
mm,
attuned to everyone else's energy, if you will,
mm,
concerns, needs, need for having a voice.
mm,
We have a very limited amount of time. Faculty like meetings, boop, 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 boop,
mm,
because and
yeah,
they have to go to class. And so, how do you hold space for all these different ideas? Get through the agenda, make sure everyone
mm,
feels seen and heard. I found pulling in was helpful and just being mindful. Okay, I'm here. I'm here in my body. We're
yeah,
gonna get through this as well as we get through this, and I think that that served me in other particularly
mm,
high stress situations. Not that, I mean, our meetings were fine, like they were friendly and
mm,
collegial, but they were rushed and they were intense. And I have such high standards for myself as a leader to
mm,
make sure that voices are heard and respect people's time about getting through agenda items. And that's a lot to do in an hour,
yeah.
which is what we usually had.
Yeah, yeah. And then it's back to back, isn't it? So there is no time
Yeah.
for that conversation
Yeah.
afterwards with the person who didn't have time to speak and et cetera, et cetera.
Well, sometimes, I mean, but also I knew people's schedules, so I would know when I could circle back if I needed to. It's
Okay.
like if you put the people first,
Yeah.
but you're still protecting your boundaries in that space, but then your strategy is and your commitment, I guess is a better
Mm,
word, is to put the people first. So you
mm,
make sure you circle back if something felt like it needed
mm,
further exploration.
mm. Thank you for sharing that. I think it's really useful for it to be intentional for people before they go into the meeting and not like, oh, I've only got 5 minutes. How do I do this?
Mhm.
Which happens to us all, doesn't it? But
Yes.
if you were to leave one final call to action to the people listening, about leading with courage, Jodi, what would it be?
I think it's recognizing your own courage and that shows up in lots of different ways. Courage is sometimes those moments, like the one I remembered, right? Of
Mm,
like, I found my voice, I took my stand. But it's really something we do moment to moment. Sometimes it's courageous just to show up to work. For whatever reason, maybe work,
mm,
whatever, life, work. But courage is a lifetime practice. And being mindful of how you're practicing it in a different chapters and different contexts, but you're the through line and your values that you want to embody, you're a work in progress with it, but you can do it over the course of your lifetime. Consider it a lifetime practice rather than holding yourself to the standard of every time I did or didn't, say the
mm,
right thing.
mm. Thank you. I'm going to leave our listeners with that. And my takeaway is that leadership isn't a position, it's a lifelong practice. Values matter, courage matters, energy matters. And what I've heard throughout this whole interview, and I thank you wholly for it, is generosity matters.
Oh,
Giving
thank you.
back through experience, through research, through writing, to people listening, I think is one of the ways that we can have more of an impact. even just sat in front of this screen. So thank you very much, Jodi.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, I hope listeners will check out my book where you can hear some really cool stories about this.
Yeah, where can they find your book and where can they find more about you?
Yeah, my website is jodivandenbergdaves.com. My book is Leading with Courage, a career-long guide for idealistic women. You can ask your local bookstore to buy it. You can buy it at bookshop.org to support local bookstores or your other big retailers whose names don't need to be mentioned.
Excellent. And I will put those notes in the show, those links in the show notes so that people can find you easily. Thank you,
Yeah.
Jodi. Thanks for a great conversation.
Thank you. This was great.
Thanks.